Next we're going to hear from James Dalziel. James is Dean of Education at Morling Theological College and is a professor at the University of Divinity. James's interests including educational technology, learning design, Christian education and moral values in education. Please welcome James.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you here. I want to take a slightly smaller chunk of the big question to look at today, and to take this issue of how do you love your neighbour, and I'm going to think here particularly your political neighbour, and by neighbour I don't mean someone whose views are very close to yours. I mean they could be a very long way from yours. And to do that I'm going to use some work from social psychology or moral psychology by leading researcher in the US, Jonathan Haidt. I suspect many of you may know of him. He's a colleague of mine. My background is originally I was in education at Macquarie University for about 12 years and a lecturer in psychology before that at Sydney University. So where I'd like to go is to try and think about the fact that ultimately we all care about truth when it comes down to debate and thinking through ideas. We want to know what is the case. In some cases it's very complicated to know the truth, or the truth is very difficult to understand or is mixed with many different pieces. I would acknowledge all of those things. Nonetheless, we want to do our best to move towards understanding truth. But when we are debating with people, be it colleagues or those who think very differently to ourselves, to try and get to the truth, I would argue requires both humility and empathy. We don't know all things. We are flawed in our human nature and we easily mistake things. We are prone to things like motivated reasoning, picking off the ideas that suit our argument, ignoring those that don't. And also to try and understand our opponent or our colleagues' ideas for why they matter to them, why are they important to them, and why indeed might they have truths in them that I don't understand. And I think one of the greatest exponents of doing this in the last 100 years or so was G.K. Chesterton. If you know, Chesterton was an extraordinary defender of many unpopular ideas in his time, but almost all of his opponents really liked him individually because he would listen very closely to what they had to say and try and get to the very heart of their ideas. And only then would he then try and work out what it was he had to say to respond to them. So while he had some extraordinary, very significant debates intellectually with people, he was often much loved by his opponents. And so I think that, for me, is an image of something that we could aspire to. And to do this, I've found Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory to be extremely useful. It's given me new ways of understanding people who disagree with me, and more empathy and more humility. And so I want to offer it to you today as an example of how to love your intellectual or your political neighbour in a way that's sort of different. Now, for those of you who have not come across Jonathan Haidt's work, he poses that pretty much most, if not almost all of the debates we have in society, particularly political debates, moral debates, have underneath them 6 moral foundations. And each foundation is a kind of spectrum from one end to another, and these are the 6. Care, this is, love your neighbour, care for others, don't allow others to be harmed, and harm that people get hurt. So that one's almost universal. Everyone would accept that as a moral foundation. The second one is liberty and its opposite, oppression, that people should be free to live the way they want to make their own choices, to not be oppressed by government or others. Obviously one of great importance at this conference. The third one is fairness and its opposite, cheating. And so people should be able to experience fairness before the law in a range of contexts. People should not cheat one another. Now, it's interesting because in my view, fairness is the most important word of Australian political debate, because it means 2 different things. For people on the conservative, libertarian, it tends to mean something like meritocracy. If you work hard, you should get your, just rewards for your work. And if you, don't work hard, then you shouldn't get anything. That's the fairness of, the conservative side. On the progressive side, fairness tends to mean those who have suffered and experienced bad things in life should be raised up. That's what fairness is, to raise up those who have suffered and had bad experiences. Another way of putting that is that conservatives believe in equality of opportunity, whereas progressives believe in equality of outcome. So I suspect they'll be very familiar to many of you, but I think that whenever you have a debate in Australia on a political issue, very often hidden underneath it is a debate about two definitions of fairness. So it's worth saying that in Jonathan Haidt's scheme, fairness is predominantly the meritocratic type of fairness, and its opposite is cheating, because that's, would make sense. The fourth one is loyalty, and its opposite, betrayal. This could be loyalty to your family, to your religious group, to your ethnic group, to your country. All these kinds of loyalties to groups. Authority, and its opposite, subversion. This is your willingness to accept rightly constituted authority. So a proper government, or other agents of government, that is a moral value to respect that. To subvert that would be its opposite. And finally, and interesting for a person who admits that he has no religious beliefs, he's an atheist, he doesn't believe in a God. Haidt has identified that sanctity and its opposite, degradation, is also a moral value. A kind of a way of thinking about one's life in a pure way, that he says this phrase, the body is a temple, is not just a religious belief. It turns up in all sorts of contexts. And it is also, and its opposite, possible to do things which are degrading to oneself or to another. So if you haven't come across it before, that's Haidt's basic framework. He argues for it from an evolutionary perspective. I'm happy to argue from it for just a social learning kind of perspective. There are different ways you could come at it. But the reason I show this to you is I want to show the data that Haidt has been collecting about how people of different political persuasions think about this. Oh, and sorry, I do want to just, given the talk of this, there's quite a bit of biblical basis for those 6 foundations. I'm not going to talk to that one today. I just want to kind of flag that that's there. By all means, ask me about that later. What I'm going to show you is this. This is the attempt to sort of give a general diagram of the kind of results that Haidt has seen. And if you haven't seen this before, I want you to imagine these 6 areas and a questionnaire where you're given a range of questions that you could answer along these lines. So it would indicate how strongly you feel about each one of these ideas. How strongly do you feel that care is really important? How strongly do you feel that liberty is really important? So what I then ask you is, imagine that if Haidt had collected data in the order of hundreds of thousands of people from across the world, what kind of pattern would you expect to see for progressive voters? People who identify as progressives, particularly strongly progressive, how would they look on that diagram? How much would they give to care? How much would they give to liberty? By the way, they can give 10 out of 10 to all of them in theory. It's just what is typical. So if you've got some at least guess on it, let me show you roughly what Haidt's proposal looks like. Very strong on care, quite strong on liberty, but particularly on the raising up of oppression version of liberty. Moderately on fairness, but low or almost non-existent on loyalty, authority, and sanctity. Now, what do you think a typical conservative, and here I'll think of a traditional conservative, not a libertarian, I'll show you that one in a moment. What might a typical conservative look like on the same kind of scale? How would they rate it across here? I'll just show it. So, you got a chance if you haven't thought this before? Okay, this is what Haidt's data looks like basically. Conservatives give roughly equal, on average, weight to all 6 of those foundations. Now, what that might tell you is that when you imagine debates between traditional conservatives and progressives, you're going to see progressives focusing mainly up the first 3 categories, and potentially you're not going to even understand why the other 3 categories might be moral issues for people, from the other side in this. Now, the fact that they're straight lines, that's just illustrative. They're never exactly the same, but they're certainly, the point is the broad sweep. Now, let me show you what libertarians look like compared to conservatives. You can probably guess at this, but liberty, obviously, very high. Fairness, high in terms of rule of law and so on. Care, it's certainly important, but not at the same levels of others. And typically, although not for all, low interest in loyalty, subversion, and sanctity. So I give you to that as just a very short overview framework of Haidt's ideas. What I want to show you is what I've been doing with this in recent times to help me think about debates with other people. If you create a grid, a 6x6 grid out of using these aspects, and you imagine, let's say that across the top we're going to have people on the right, or conservatives, and down the side we've got people on the left. And then we take an issue and work out where is the point of disagreement, or where is the point of conflict. So let me give you an easy one. If we were in the US and we were looking at, say, oh, and by the way, right and left, yes, it's simplistic. I totally agree. But it's broad enough that it still gives us something useful here. So let's say if we take gun control in the US, what do you think the right primary moral foundation would be? Liberty? Okay. What would be the left primary moral issue? Care? So that would be the cell that represents the point of the disagreement in moral values. And so if you're trying to talk about gun control debates in the US, until you understand that that's the fundamental thing going on, you're likely to just talk through each other. So let me give you one or two others just to give you a bit of experience of this. Let's take long-term welfare payments. So people who have been on welfare for a long time and show no signs that they're going to be able to come off that welfare. What would be the primary concern for a conservative about that? Fairness, probably. I mean, potentially you might say care as in it is damaging for them to be on welfare so long. I wouldn't disagree with that. But fairness is typically the concern. It's not fair that people should have, kind of unlimited funds, in that circumstance. On the left, what would be the concern? Care once again. So in this case, it's that cell that identifies the kind of pivot point often of that debate. All right, now I want to give you an interesting one. I want to think about the debate we've had in Australia over about the last 10, 15 years around illegal immigrants or refugees. Do you remember back to John Howard's comment on this, the famous one where he said, we're the ones who decide, who will come into our country? That famous quote. What moral argument was he using at that point? Authority. Okay, so what would then be the progressive response? Care? All right. So that's what we saw in that case with Howard's. Now it's interesting, if you are speaking to the conservative base, then they will find that a very attractive argument because they think authority is a strong moral value. What if, however, you had a different option? What if you were trying to counteract the view of a progressive? Well, let me show you something interesting. If we now think Scott Morrison, when he had the portfolio a couple of years ago, do you remember almost all of his discussion was, look at how many people have been drowning as they try and come across on boats. How risky and terrible it is that all these people have lost their lives. In caring for them, we must stop them from coming. Can you see it's a care versus care argument? And so in that case, I'd say that is the kind of argument you would use when you were trying to neutralise or counteract an argument where that same moral basis is being used in that case by the progressives. So same issue, but different choice of argument or example depending on purpose. Right. And so in the case of just briefly, I've changed the graph here from conservative and I've put libertarian down the side. And I think this one's pretty easy. But when you think about bike helmets, drugs, vaping, any number of them, the conservative concern on these will be care and the libertarian concern will be? Okay, so it'll wind up there. All right, lastly, just one that caught my eye recently. The Greens Party suggested a couple of months ago that we should legalise cannabis. I don't know if you saw this one. And the AMA came out and said, no, this would be bad for people because it acts as a gateway drug and will lead to more harm overall. So this is an interesting case where doctors, again I put them up here, would be arguing for care, and the Greens, who are supposed to be the most progressives of progressives, and hence the ones most likely to have the highest care on their graph, actually were arguing a liberty argument. Just thought that was interesting. All right, so how do we wrap this up? How do you love your intellectual or political neighbour? I think one of the things we can do is use this kind of grid to help us understand the moral priorities of other people and sometimes our own as a way to better unpack what's going on underneath. So that would be a proposal that I would bring. And the other thing I'd say is, in some cases, if you're debating with someone where they have a very compelling position and yet you think it is not the right position or it's not true, how can you provide an alternative argument? Well, for one of the ways to do it is to think about what moral foundation is essential to their argument, and do I have any counter arguments or examples that I can present from that basis? There's no point arguing from your own moral foundations if your opponents don't even think they're moral ideas. So better to find out an example that would fit from theirs. Let me end off with this quote. This is from G.K. Chesterton, writing over 100 years ago, illustrating once again the risk that whatever you think is a good idea today, Chesterton probably said it 100 years ago. He said, when a religious scheme is shattered... Ooh, did I get that? There we go. Religious scheme is shattered, as Christianity was shattered in the Reformation. It's not merely the vices that are let loose. The vices are indeed let loose, and they wander and do damage. But the virtues are let loose also. And the virtues wander more wildly, and the virtues do more terrible damage. The modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they've been isolated from each other and they are wandering alone. Thus, some scientists care for truth, and the truth is pitiless. Thus, some humanitarians care only for pity, and the pity, I'm sorry to say, is often untruthful. Thank you.
We've got a number of questions here. Doesn't Christianity align more with conservatism rather than libertarianism due to conservative values and Christian values seeming consistent?
I feel I should take this given the slides I showed. I think it's not an easy question to answer. I would say that there are some strong themes in the New Testament about freedom for Christians, that some of the old Judaic laws no longer apply for those who have freedom in Christ. And so Paul talks about obligations of circumcision, not eating meats prepared for idols, these kinds of things, that for the Christian who is at one with God, that these kind of obligations are set aside and they live with freedom. So I think in that sense there is a stronger sense of freedom and liberty for the Christian than you might otherwise think is true, particularly if your image of Christianity is a kind of Victorian moralising kind of view. Having said that though, I think that some of our major debates in society of recent years have been around things related to sanctity issues, the sanctity of marriage and so on. And that these are things in the Bible. And so to the extent the libertarian view is that, no, I should have freedom to do anything I like with my body or in my life, that's not going to sit easily with a Christian view, whereas that more traditional conservative view of kind of social conservatism and morality will sit more easily with that. I think to offer an answer for why that might still be a reasonable view to consider, one of the problems we have with the word freedom now is it tends to mean freedom to do anything you like. Whereas I would say the Bible's view of freedom is more, you were created to be a certain kind of person, and it's freedom to be all that you can be as that person. And so there are constraints around life in all sorts of ways, but it is about living to the fullness within that. So to give you an example, one of the things doctors are starting to run into from time to time is people who would like to have a limb removed for their body when there's nothing wrong with that limb. They just choose that they would like to have that limb removed. And the doctor has to sort of hit the point of, well, would I do a kind of seemingly unnecessary surgery just because the person wants that, the freedom to want it? Or would I say, you know what, it's not good for you to cut off your arm. You're better to live within the life you have. So I think that for me would be an example where we need to actually think about what freedom means. And for me, from a Christian perspective, freedom is partly about the freedom to live in the way that we are, in the way that we are made, rather than the freedom to do anything we like at any time.
Amen. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes our panel. But if you could all please stand, gentlemen, and if you could all show your appreciation to our speakers today.